Untitled Pilates, and in this video we are going to look at the fundamental concept of extension. We will look in this video primarily at spinal extension and hip extension, focusing mostly in that prone or laying on your stomach position that we do quite often in Pilates, do a lot in my classes to help strengthen that whole back chain of the body. So let's get into it. I'm going to have you lay on your stomach, and we are going to start with a prop underneath the hips. So kind of a prop right at the hip points. I've rolled up a blanket. You can roll the blanket up more or less depending on how much lift you want for your hips off of the floor. I'm starting with a lift of maybe 3 inches, roughly. And then we're going to lay down on that prop, the hip points on the blanket. Hands stack, forehead resting on your hands. And then legs are long behind you. You can have them more narrow. It usually feels a little nicer on the SI joint to go wider to maybe the width of your mat. So letting everything get heavy, maybe take a little rock of the pelvis side to side for a moment. And then the reason that we have the prop under the hips to start is because laying on our stomach, we're already asking hip flexors to extend and kind of release. And if hip flexors are tight from sitting for long periods of time, this can be a position that's already pretty extreme for the body and hard to get this spinal extension work or hip extension work out of the low back. So we're using the prop to help support the lumbar spine and get more into the upper and mid back as we do spinal extension, glute and hamstring as we do hip extension. So we'll start with the hand stacked, and then I want you to just go through a couple rocks of your pelvis. So we're going to take an inhale, and then as you exhale, I want you to tuck the tail under and feel your pubic bone get heavier into the blanket and try to draw the blanket towards your belly button. And you can think about this also as imprinting your low back on the ceiling. So my belly is drawing up away from the floor. It might not actually lift off of the floor, but there's a feeling of lightness there. And then I'm going to release. So letting the pubic bone release the blanket away from me. I get a little bit of an arch through my low back. And then as I tuck the tail, exhale, gather the blanket towards me, imprint my low back on the ceiling. Good, and then release. So as we fatigue, usually the abdominals release their engagement and we default to kind of dumping the low back in the low back or the belly flattening into the floor. So I want you to, on this next rep, we'll bring the hands underneath the shoulders. The head is going to float in space. So if you have a bigger chest, the head might be floating a few inches away from that or a little bit further away. I've got pretty small chest, so my gaze is just an inch or so off the mat. We're trying to keep the head in line with the rest of your spine, wherever that is. And then I'm actively pressing through the arms, letting my shoulders relax away from the ears. And then I'm going to do that same, tuck the tail under, pull the blanket towards me, engage a little bit of that wrap at the glutes. So everything in my trunk and my core is helping to support a long low back. Taking an inhale, hands stay down. I'm going to draw the hands towards my feet as I reach my sternum forward and then lift into a little bit of extension. And as I do that, I am keeping that feeling of the pubic bone drawing my blanket towards my belly button. I want to avoid dumping in the low back and making it about low back extension. So really focusing on thoracic extension as we're here. Also noticing the gaze is just going to be a couple inches in front of your nose. A lot of times we'll overcompensate with cervical extension and the gaze will come up the wall. But I want you to think again, little tuck of the chin, even extension through the whole spine, and then lower down. So that hands down for support is an awesome option. You can also play with floating the hands lifting the sternum forward and then up. See if you can get the activation in the mid and upper back more than neck, more than low back. And then we lower down. So press yourself up. And then I'm going to just move the blanket out of the way. So you can keep that blanket there for every series of prone extension work. It's an awesome prop to use to help keep the work, again, out of the low back gripping. Otherwise, without the prop there, you can see I'm in less hip flexion. So I'm asking my hip flexors to lengthen. And then from here, so if we sit a lot, again, this is going to be a hard place to just lengthen through the front of the hip and then stabilize. So as we do this second set, if it feels like low back takes over, bring that prop back underneath you. We're going to gather through the pubic bone. Belly draws away from the floor, imprinting your low back on the ceiling, and then hands can stay down or hover. Find that same lift of the sternum forward and up. And then lower down with control. Great. So hands are going to stack. We're going to do a little bit of hip extension now. So head resting on the hands, trying to let the upper body relax. Take a shake of the pelvis, side to side. And then just like with our upper body, this kind of lack of flexion at the hips is going to maybe even be more challenging for when we do this hip extension. So while I'm here, I want to tuck the tail under, come into that imprint, stabilize belly drawing away from the floor. And then I'm going to reach really, really long through my right leg, so much so that maybe my glute and hamstring can float my leg off of the mat. Maybe the thigh gets a little lighter on the mat, maybe the thigh actually lifts. And then I lower down. We're going to go to the other side. Left leg reaches really, really long. And then it's from my butt thigh, so right below my butt crease, engaging to float the leg up. And as I lift, I want to avoid dumping in the low back. So belly gathers up and in. Maybe we don't lift as high. And then lower down. So a lot of firing through the glutes and the hamstrings. If you feel like low back is just gripping with this, put the blanket back underneath your pelvis. The other option is to play with hip extension, glute hamstring strengthening in a quadruped. So we'll do a lot of prone work in classes. Maybe you've done work there before, but it doesn't mean you have to do it on your stomach if it's all going into your low back. So on hands and knees, I'm at pretty flexed hips, 90-degree bend at the hips. So as I go into hip extension, as I reach my leg out, I'm still in a little bit of hip flexion. And then I can lift my leg to the point of where I'm laying on the floor and lower back down. And then I can really focus on that hammock rock, hip extension from the glute and hamstring, lower with control. When we're laying on our stomach, we're starting here, and then we're lifting as much or as little as we can without dumping in the low back to get higher. So lowering down, something to think about when you are doing extension, especially of the lower half of hip extension, laying on your stomach. Sometimes it might feel better, just come up onto hands and knees or forearms and knees if wrist feels sensitive, and do that leg reaching long, floating up to kind of parallel with the rest of your body and lowering down, and then you'll slowly work up to that laying on the stomach, legs lifting and lowering from there. All right, I hope that was informational, educational, and helpful for you in group classes or in videos that you do with me in the future. If you have questions or comments, as always, please let me know, and I will see you next time. All right, bye.